and its structures wrong. A small anecdote. I've been doing this for, God help me, 25 years now. I started a broadcasting research unit in 1985 in the wake of the Peacock Committee having been set up. And having been appointed as a minnow research fellow, one of the first things I was told when I started on my first day was, what we have to realise is that the BBC is facing the fight of its life. 1985. I've not met Frank Field. I'm sorry he's gone, because I've always had enormous respect for him. I think he is fundamentally wrong in virtually everything that he said. I just want to make 3 points, really. But what I want to start with is the starting point for this whole debate, which for me isn't the BBC review. It's a complete incomprehension, which is shared almost wherever I go, in papers abroad, that we in Britain have this habit of always wanting to lay into the BBC, whereas virtually everywhere else you go, and Jeremy Hunt said it yesterday, they talk about, and I'll quote him, a great national institution, quite rightly the envy of the world. Now, that's ours. We created this. It is, as other people have said, actually held in enormous affection by the vast majority of people. It is one of the few public institutions in which trust is rising, and is held in greater trust than virtually every other public institution. It is seen as very good value by the vast majority of people who pay the license fee. And I think what Frank was doing was unfortunately confusing the politics of the license fee with the politics of public service broadcasting. And there may well be an issue, over 75 states are free already. As I understand it, there was already an element in income support for those people who can't afford it, which covers the license fee. So why is it, when we have this institution, which is admired, liked, trusted, is fantastic value, and does virtually everything that we want to do across the board in cultural and democratic terms, that we usually see fit to try and kick it up the arse? Well, by all means, let's try and create a BBC that is, the usual buzzwords, more efficient, more accountable, etc. I happen to think the accountability structures that Tessa is primarily responsible for are actually quite hard to beat. I'm sure there are sort of improvements that can be made. But what I want to do is to look at what would be lost. Because whenever we start talking about, Richard talks about, and it's quite a common theme, the nature of more plural institutions. Once we start withdrawing money from the BBC, what happens to it? It becomes smaller, it becomes less effective, it becomes fragmented, and ultimately we will end up with an institution which is actually not much different from PBS in America. Marginalised, unloved, ineffectual. Why do we want to do that? Why do we want to end up with that? I really don't get it. And I would like the starting point to be, what do we want, why do we need to change something that does as much good as the BBC does? On the theme of what's going to be lost, I want to pick up 2 points in particular, which is investment. At the moment we have, it's a difficult calculation to make, but I've roughly estimated the BBC's expenditure on original content in television is about $1.5 billion a year. It's difficult to break down, but I've done my best. What does, that's out of the total revenue of $3.5 billion. Now, B-Sky B this year, total revenue will be around $6 billion. How much of that goes on original content? Does anyone know? Well, you won't know because they refuse to tell anyone.
It's $1 billion.
Sorry?
I think you find it's $1 billion.
No, excluding sport. Let's exclude sports rights because my estimation for the BBC, $1.5 billion, was excluding sports rights. The answer is that approximately. The answer is in terms of creating original content, right? Not retransmitting events that are already out there. Creating new talent, new comedy, new producers, actually creating content that didn't pre-exist. By my estimation, it's around 100 million. And that's probably generous. But, as I say, B-Sky won't tell us. We don't know how much is being spent on original production. If Frank Field was talking about the private sector, there are certain bits that the private sector will cherry pick. But so far, there has been very little evidence that once the BBC withdraws, the private sector will pick it up. It is a very common rhetorical device to say, if it wasn't for the BBC, there would be a flowering of private sector initiatives. Great example, BBC Jam, a terrific educational service provided for kids, but those kids who were using it, loved by those kids, had to be withdrawn because of objections by educational publishers. They said, we'll do that. They haven't. There is no sign of any service, any equivalence to that service that had to be closed down, ultimately because of orders from Brussels, but because of the lobby by the educational publishers. Now, I think we really have to appreciate, if we're going to start talking about taking money out of the BBC, if we're going to start either reducing the licence fee or reallocating that money, what are we going to lose? Where are the cuts going to come? And are we being realistic about what's going to be taken up by the private sector? Because I think this narrative is actually being driven, and for perfectly understandable reasons, is being driven by those commercial rivals who are suffering. Particularly, if you like, the newspaper publishers who really need to monetize their online content and cannot do that as long as there is a universally available, free, well-resourced BBC. So I think what we're seeing is a narrative that starts with, Tessa alluded to it, and I know for a fact it's true of most senior politicians, very heavy lobbying by private sector commercial rivals. That starts the narrative going. That's partly explains some of the political hostility, which then transforms into a sense that we have to, quote, do something about the BBC. Actually, most people don't want to do something about the BBC. Now, I haven't talked about the review, and I'm not suggesting that there isn't room for a strategic look at what this mass audience, well-resourced institution should be doing. And I think there is an argument that post-2012, post-digitalisation, a BBC that was made to lead us into that digital transformation has done that job, might be reconfigured in some way. And I certainly think that there is a big issue, having said in front of Caroline, about senior executive salaries, which I think are seen as desperately out of touch in the current environment. And I think at the very least, a notional sacrifice of 5% of any salary over 200,000 would be a very good starting point. Why not put that into a pot to help pay for those who genuinely struggle to pay the license? But okay.